Counting the overlooked hidden homeless. That's our discussion today. And it's something that University of Rhode Island College of Health Sciences Assistant Professor of Public Health, Molly Richard, has been digging into. Professor, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Hidden homelessness. There's a lot of ways to take that. When we talk about it today, though, we're kind of looking at, from an academic research standpoint, a very specific term known as doubling up that I think is
hmm
foundational to our conversation today. Explain what doubling up is and how that ties into the broader notion of the hidden homeless.
Yeah, so doubled up homelessness refers to staying temporarily with friends or family or other people because of economic hardship or just inability to obtain housing of your own. We have different definitions of homelessness at the policy level, service systems, and some federal agencies include doubling up in their definition of homelessness. So we can talk about that, like the Department of Education. And so that's where that definition that I just said comes from the Department of Education. And so you might hear some variations on that, but that's the general idea. So you're staying with other people because you can't figure out, keeping a roof on your own head, and you're trying to avoid entering shelters or living outside.
So this would be like somebody couch surfing or a mother and child that are sleeping in a single room at it's someone's their mother or grandmother's house or something like that. Or
Yeah,
the scenario that we see a lot of times where multiple adults, multiple families even are under one roof in one apartment or one room at times. There's a
yeah,
gap here in how we measure homelessness because of these situations and many others. Is that basically the finding?
yeah, definitely. And it's something that people who are, advocates for affordable housing and homelessness and housing insecurity have talked about for a long time. It's been something that researchers have also looked at, but just the ability to measure that when kind of the whole idea is that folks are trying to find a place to stay that they're not, seeing, and that they can remain stable, it has been kind of a methodological issue. But all the different cases that you described, so whether it's like a young adult couch surfing, going friends to friend's house, so they can, stay at the same school, or a family, all sleeping in a room in another relative's house, all of those situations kind of are under that umbrella of doubling up.
Do we know how this is on a local level impacting the numbers that we get? We just had our case in point, or I'm sorry, our point in time study release
Yeah.
shows the number of unhoused people in the state. And look, we've been covering on the podcast, on the radio, this issue for so many years now that every winter the same thing is true. The real number is probably not what our actual real time number shows in terms of the advocates and organizations. It's probably a lot higher.
hmm
This
Yep.
feeds that notion. Do you have any idea what that number really looks like?
That's a good question, Bill. I think first, the point in time count itself is generally seen as an underestimate of sheltered and unsheltered homelessness. So, for those who are living outside or in an encampment, that's what we refer to as unsheltered homelessness. And then sheltered homelessness is, you're staying in an emergency shelter or another kind of homeless service program, transitional housing. All of those folks are counted in the point in time count. But we also know that there are people living outside, especially people living in their cars or in places where, they're just not seen in the one night or 1 week effort that is a really awesome effort by all the volunteers, but not everybody is going to be counted. And there's some great research across the country that has kind of tested that in different ways. Um, but then, yeah, of course, that's also not going to include anyone who is doubled up because it's guided by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development's definition of homelessness. And that only includes sheltered and unsheltered. So even if we kind of had like a running list of everybody who was couch surfing, they wouldn't be in that count. And so we do have some other ways of looking at it. But generally, when you see that point in time number, that's not going to include anybody in that situation.
And there's a real problem that comes from this besides just that which you highlight, which on just a human level, you go, wow, that number is much bigger. And there's a lot more various levels of suffering happening in this space that
Yeah.
might be accounted for. There's an actual real time financial problem, which is that you just mentioned. HUD excludes doubling up from their definition of homeless. And that
hmm
an ineligibility for a lot of people when it comes to significant federal homelessness assistance programs. So that problem exists.
Mhm.
How
Yeah.
big a problem is this? I mean, it seems like this would be
Right,
a
right.
major.
I realized, I went into all of my thoughts and feelings about how we define it in the conception, but I didn't give you that number when you actually asked me, right? So
Yep.
I would say, the most recent point in time count was around 2,300, right? I think, and then we have school data on doubled up homelessness that is also, I think it's around 1,200. I can look it up. You can put it in the notes or something, but it's like a little bit over 1,000 for doubled up students. So you could kind of think about adding that. And then the way that I've estimated doubled up homelessness is using Census Bureau data. Some community partners and I say, okay, we have these household level surveys. How can we try to get at those who are staying with others probably because they have nowhere else to go? So we kind of looked at poverty, household relationships, and overcrowding. And so in Rhode Island for 2024, um, we could guess or estimate that almost 10,000 people were living in a doubled up situation on any given time. So it's kind of like the point in time count, but it's more like any given time across the year, like the average characteristics. And so that's what that data would show. And again, it's kind of our best way to enumerate something that is pretty hard to capture.
That's an incredible number when you really think about that in context of what goes out over the air, I'll say at times,
Hmm.
the number that
Yeah.
we sort of reference is, "Oh, there's about 1,500 people at most at any point in time who are on the streets." Okay, maybe. But when you expand that to 10,000 and consider doubling up as a form of homelessness, as it is, that is a shocking number. So it leads to a couple of things. One, questions about causation. I read an article that you published in the Journal of Urban Affairs on community level predictors of doubling up.
Mm.
And yes, there's a lot in there, but one of the key takeaways is that as you have high unemployment and high rent or high cost of living in general, that's going to increase doubling up. That makes sense. But there's more to it than just that. What are your findings in terms of the causation beyond just the general causes of homelessness that increase doubling up, the amount of people who are doubling up on any given day?
Yeah. So I will say, I think that those general kind of understood structural causes of homelessness and housing insecurity, so cost of rent, economic stability around like the gap between people's incomes and the social safety net and the cost of housing are those key structural drivers. And so, in that article, I looked at median rent, I looked at access to TANF, so public assistance. Sometimes it was related depending on the specific group you're looking at, but generally, research around homelessness and housing insecurity doubling up, all of that is going to be pointing to those structural conditions. But when it comes to kind of thinking about, okay, where might we see more doubling up versus other forms of homelessness or housing insecurity? One thing to think about is just, what is the access to shelter? What does the service system look like? And that might differ geographically, that might differ city to city, and also access in the sense of for certain people, they might feel like they have the ability to access shelter because they speak the language of the shelter there, but for others, they might not. We also see, for example, like I'm working on a project in LA, looking at doubled up homelessness, interviewing people, and for many Latina folks in the population, they're avoiding shelter and they're avoiding being seen unsheltered because of fear of immigration enforcement and ICE. And so, kind of trying to get ahead of it to say, hey, if you see numbers of Latino homelessness going down in the shelters, that doesn't mean housing insecurity is not an issue. It just means it's manifesting in a different way. So there's all of these reasons why folks may try to basically stay with whoever they can to avoid shelter or other forms of homelessness. But the point of kind of shining a light on that is to say, hey, when we think about the broad spectrum of homelessness and housing insecurity, we should be thinking about it this way in terms of the scale of resources and the scale of response. And also, if we ever want to actually, prevent and end homelessness, we want to think about the inflow into our shelters and into the experiences people have living outside. And so a lot of research will show that, the last living situation people had who are unsheltered or sheltered was a doubled up situation. So maybe half of them, looking at different studies, right? And so if we want to, move upstream and prevent homelessness, and kind of really think about it either from a public health prevention framework, or just this idea of it actually can be kind of cost effective to intervene a little bit earlier for people and try to prevent them from having these traumatic experiences. Better understanding how to address unstable doubled up situations can help with that, I think.
What are some of well, you identify a four-pronged strategy, if you will, that is sort
Hmm.
of wrap around in this issue as a whole. What are the solutions you propose to addressing this in terms of real-time reaction? Because a lot of it has to do with less, "Hey, we're gonna prevent doubling up," but also, or I should say more so, we're gonna identify doubling up as part of the broader problem that we're confronting.
Yeah. So in that short research brief, I kind of tried to just organize some of the ways that we can think about response, because there's no silver bullet. Like you and others who have been covering homelessness and housing insecurity know that there's not just one thing Rhode Island can do to fix the situation we're in, or that the nation can do to tackle the housing crisis. But I thought about it in the sense of, okay, we can think about homelessness response. So how are people getting the services when they need when they feel, like that their situation is one of homelessness. And so some people in these situations may or may not feel that way. It's just a lot of variation. But where's the access, and how can people get support that they need? And so some local jurisdictions will expand their specific definition of homelessness. So even if HUD's going to define it a certain way, hey, if we have our own service system, like funded by the city or state in little pieces. And Rhode Island, sometimes, we're still figuring out how we're going to do that in some ways. We could have a different definition. And then homelessness prevention. And so there's not a lot of consistent federal funding for homelessness prevention, but when there is funding for that, so much of it does go to those who are doubled up. And so, like, for example, there's a housing stability pilot that we've had in the state for a little bit that's doing a really great job to try to keep people in their housing. And often those are either folks who are doubled up for a little bit and need to get back into housing, or to kind of prevent them from having to be in that situation. And then just the broader housing affordability and availability. Again, I'm saying, these are big things. These are big buckets. This wasn't, yeah, bill one, bill two, bill three, bill four. Um, but really broad areas. And so we could talk more about those ways to tackle the housing affordability and availability if you want to. But I know you've done that in other places, and I'm happy to say a little bit about it. And then economic stability, because you can't afford housing if you don't have any income. So, yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I don't think we can have any serious discussion about housing or affordability without talking about things like you just raised. And I'm extraordinarily interested, and I'm sure the audience is as well, to hear your take on what is the fundamental issue, not only to the unhoused crisis, but to
Mm,
a lot of the major issues we face in this state. People can't
yeah.
afford to be here. Let's be real. This is crazy. Give me a break. And never mind if the bird, by the way, that's working people are
Yeah.
having a hard time. So now take that a step back and imagine someone whose income is either fixed or doesn't exist at all. What
Mhm.
what a struggle. What do you see
Yeah.
at what are you seeing and hearing and thinking about in terms of solutions?
Well, I'll disclose I am new to Rhode Island. I'm here for a couple of years. And I grew up in the Boston area. And before that, I was in Nashville. And it was really sad and hard to see just how quickly those cities were changing, and how people were displaced based on the decisions that state and city policymakers were making, in terms of here's how we want to see us grow, and here's how we want to see development. I think Nashville is a bit of a, better example in sort of that rapid kind of change. And so being here, it's been so cool to just see how much attention and energy there is around wanting to do something different and wanting to prevent that from happening 10 years down the line, you know? And so I will say that there's just such a cool slate of policies around building more housing, preserving the affordable housing we have, adapting it, trying to regulate rent and stabilize that as an emergency brake, given the fact that we are already in a crisis. And I think that thinking about doubling up is another way to sort of visualize that. I think when we can't see the pain that people are in, related to the housing crisis and the cost of rent, it's easy to just say, "Let's build housing and then it'll get better." But it won't, and for many, many years if that's the only way that we approach it. So that's some of my thoughts on it.
Well, it's such an important framework right now, right? It's the basic one, which is a Keynesian approach versus a supply side approach. And there's people are stuck in their camps on this. But I would think of the California governor's race, where a recent New York Times produced forum on the housing crisis talked about something that I thought was really interesting that we haven't heard a lot about here, which is modular homes. Yeah, we've heard
Mm.
about the shelters off 146 there at the oh my God, I can't believe I can't remember the name of the
Echo Village?
Echo Village exactly.
Yeah.
The what's the facility what
Pilot
the
shelters?
thank you. Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
And we
You
hear a
got
lot
it.
about that, but now yesterday, we're recording this on May 27th, the morning of May 26th, East Providence Mayor De Silva introduced something that I saw all the time when I was living in Brooklyn. It was kind of a hipster move, in a way,
Mhm.
flex or something. But now shipping container houses and modular homes coming to Rhode Island. What I am fearful of is a reduction in standards and qualities
Yeah.
and locations, whether we're moving zoning around or doing things that are wacky or not. I just worry about
Mhm.
the idea of, well, we need to build more housing, so let's just build a bunch of garbage housing for people, stuff them in there. That's not a solution either. And so
Yeah.
you're totally right. It's a
Yeah.
spectrum.
I agree with that. I think that it's nice to distinguish between, some of those kinds of housing that we see as stable versus, sort of long term versus the things like the Eco Village shelters, because I think people have found those to be um a really safe and positive experience for when you compare them to the congregate shelters that people are forced to be in when they have nowhere else to go. And so I think having that as an option for people as a bridge to permanent housing is really great, and we can put some of our effort into that. But yeah, we aren't trying to. It's not a technocratic fix to just create these little. I think what we're doing in East Providence is great across the board, just building more housing, and they're being really creative with different things. And I haven't seen the details of what you're talking about, but generally on the same page around we want to have high quality conditions. It's in so many domains of what that means, um, and there's no quick way to get there with everything, but, I don't know, I think in a small state, we do have there's some strength in that, we can put our arms around the problem, even though 10,000 is a big number. When I was looking at it in other places, like, we're talking about LA, it's like 200,000, so, um, yeah, I think we can do that. Um, yeah,
Yeah, it does seem like it's a manageable problem at a certain level where when you
yeah,
look at scale, it's possible. Bottom line, though, is your work now focusing on something that literally is is just not it is either not discussed in general or it is discussed in sort of an afterthought in a lot of the conversations that I've heard about the unhoused in Rhode Island, where it's almost like, okay, good, someone's got a shelter, they're on a couch, they're at their grandmother's house, they're whatever it may be.
yeah,
We can triage and say, great, they're stable. Now let's focus on the people who are literally out in the cold and then just move on. And then it starts to get warm and all of that. And then, oh, good, the World Cup's here and it's beach, get your Dells out. Next thing you know, it's it just gets left behind. And so your work is truly, truly so essential to this conversation and such a welcome introduction in this moment. I know you've been working on this for a while, but to me, this was new. And what do you? I guess last question: what do you hope that your work, your body of work, and it getting into a wider ecosystem right now, how do you hope that influences the conversation on a policy level when it comes to, well, you've already outlined your solutions, so to speak, but
mhm.
if the governor hears this or any of the candidates or anybody hears this in state government, what do you want them to take away?
I think that, I'm hopeful that it can be part of a broader conversation on homelessness prevention. I think that, of course, that part of that is having, reliable pathways out of shelter so that if people do need support, they can go and have a crisis response. But just looking, at where we're at, if we don't kind of try to go upstream a little bit, we're never going to be able to make a dent on the issue. So whether that's continuing to fund some of those pilot programs for people or be a little bit more creative, small things just like tracking the data of who calls and they're diverted from shelter to a doubled up situation because people will call and they'll say, "Hey, are there any shelter beds available?" "No, sorry, can you try again to like, are you sure you can't stay, with the folks that you stayed with before?" Okay, yeah, I can think I can stay for one more week. And you're not really getting a lot of information about them, but then, what happens down the line? Can we look at that a little bit? So I have more ideas. I'd be happy to share with more people about it and have some more conversations. The last thing I'll ask you, because I want this to be something that everybody can be thinking about, even if they haven't yet. And there's actually a cool route into that. I don't know, Bill, have you watched The Real Housewives right now?
I have not seen it yet, however, I am saving it up
Okay,
for
save it up,
in
but just so you know, and for folks who are listening, if you want to see an interesting conversation about how we define homelessness, it came up the last 3 episodes. So if you're asking yourself, was Alicia experiencing homelessness? She was doubled up, and they kind of talk about it for a long time about what that looks like for her. And so I'm only saying that for viewers who are listening to this and thinking, this is a sort of niche issue that doesn't affect everybody. But I also see people who have been following Real Housewives talking about it in their kind of forums, being like, "What is homelessness? How do we define it?" Yeah, like, well, if she was in school, she would have been eligible for resources because she was doubled up and she was in her parents' basement or grandparents' basement. And so um, it was, I don't know. I'm just hopeful that we can actually build on that and build on some other awesome conversations we're having around how we can really think about housing insecurity as a spectrum and all the ways that we can address it and support each other.
and that's a great idea. We'll seek that clip out. Hopefully, Bravo doesn't sue us if we play it. But in any case, Molly Richard,
Blame me.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Send that direct bet to the University of Rhode Island public.
Yeah, you can.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
Molly, thanks so much for your time. This is great work, and let's keep in touch on this. I'd love to continue this discussion, especially as we get into really the thick of candidate season, and
Mhm.
it's it's such an important issue it really demands expertise. And I understand that gubernatorial candidates or the governor himself may not be expert in this on a day-to-day basis, but boy, they should be as close to the source as possible, which would be people like you in terms of getting their information.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate you having me and focusing on these issues.
Follow me on Instagram at Bill Bartholomew.